Your book also made me think about castles in a new way, because I had previously thought of them, I suppose, as principally defensive strongholds. And you talk in the book about their power to intimidate and their power to subjugate, which in this period there was a real rash of castle building in order to assert authority and basically crush the peasantry.
What's extraordinary, again, about the Millennium, the millennial period, and another reason why I wanted to write about it, is that in France particularly, almost everything that we popularly associate with the Middle Ages came into existence over a sort of period of just a few decades, a couple of decades either side of the year 1000 itself. So castles is a sort of classic example of that. And as you say, they are not defensive structures. They are inventions which enable warrior lords, warrior barons, to act with incredible aggression in the style of sort of mafia bosses moving in and carving up new fiefdoms. And to do that, of course, they require soldiers, warriors, to man these castles. And so they start recruiting an entirely new order, a new social class, which the French give the name chevalier, and the English, after 1066, will give the name knicht, knights. So this is the invention of what will go on to become knighthood. They do not start out as Arthurian paladins. They begin essentially as hired thugs. And these hired thugs are then able to go out and to round up the peasantry, as though they were sort of errant sheep or pigs, round them up and enclose them in what are sort of effectively penal colonies, to which are given the name villages. So the village also is invented in this period. And against beyond that dynamic, the dynamic of exploitation which is going on, you also have further impulses generated by the sense that the world is collapsing and fragmenting. You have the first pogrom of the Jews in Western history. You have the invention of mass pilgrimage. This is the age when people start travelling on a huge scale to Santiago in Spain and to Jerusalem. So in every way, there is a sense of a new world, I think, coming into being. And that cannot help but be fascinating.
One of the things I really enjoyed in the book was the way that you make the contemporary sources speak. And often the translations read in a very accessible, modern way. They haven't got that sort of patina of medievalism about them. They seem, in some cases, although the thoughts may be alien, the language seems as though it might have been written last year. Was that something that you had to work hard in order to orchestrate?
Well, one of the challenges of this period, as again opposed to the classical, is that a lot of the sources aren't actually translated. And I was feeling slightly intimidated by that, wondering how am I going to get hold of them. Then I went to the British Library, and there on the open shelves, huge, great leather-bound volumes dating back from all the way back to the 1840s, but with just about everything that you'd need, ready and present, of course, in Latin. And that was wonderful, and I felt truly scholarly sitting there thumbing through these sort of antique volumes. That then generated the sort of counter response, which was that I had to remember that this needs to be made accessible. It needs to be made to seem alive. And so yes, the excitement of fingering these pages, the excitement of scholarship was absolutely counterbalanced by a determination to try and make them speak sort of vividly, and I'm glad you felt that succeeded.
Tell me about writing about violence, because you have to write about a hell of a lot of violence in this book. How much of it is sort of imaginative reconstruction and how much of it comes from contemporary sources?
Well, the sources are obsessed with violence because it's of course a preoccupation. This is an incredibly violent world, and so inevitably there are a number of battles. I suppose the highlights are the Battle of the Lech, which was won by Otto the Great, which I think served Tolkien as the model for the battle that fought at Minas Tirith. They're all very dramatic and spectacular. And then of course there's the Battle of Hastings, which everyone knows about. I suppose the displays of violence that really caught my attention were those that leapt off the page, and I can think of two. One is in a chronicle written by a German bishop called Thietmar. He's spectacularly dismissive of the Poles, but he does acknowledge that the Poles could teach us one thing, and that's how to treat rapists, because the Poles have a very distinctive policy, which is that if you get caught convicted of rape, they will take you to the bridge in the town, they will place your scrotum on the wooden top of the bridge. They will get a nail and hammer it in and then leave you there with a knife, so that you have the choice of castrating yourself or killing yourself. And then just going a little further north from Germany into Denmark, there's the fabulous story of Harold Bluetooth, who gave his name to Bluetooth technology. Also should be better known, I think, for the spectacular nature of his death. He got in a war with his son. There was a big naval engagement. It was indecisive. Harold Bluetooth then got off his ship, went on shore to the local island, squatted, had a dump. While he was having his shit, got shot in the arse, and that was the end of him. And again, you read that, and that's got to go straight into the book.
Let me ask you finally, just in case listeners think that I'm sort of exaggerating the level of violence, if you could maybe read, in conclusion, part of the narrative of the Battle of Hastings, because it's the most visceral, immediate description of the battle that I've ever come across.
As the first Norman arrow showers rattled down upon the round shields of the English, and William's infantry began climbing the hill ahead of them to test the swing of the housecarls' axes, William knew that his fate was no longer his own to control. It had passed into the hands of God. Not that anyone would have expected the divine judgment to be delayed for long. Rare was the battle that lasted for more than an hour or so. The moment of crisis, when all would be decided upon a rumour or a sudden flight, was bound to sweep the field soon. And so it almost proved. Most shields were still unriven, most helmets without dents, most blades barely notched, when all of a sudden word began to pass through the Norman ranks that William had fallen. His men were thrown into panic. As they turned and started stumbling and slipping back down the hill, it seemed as though the retreat was on the verge of becoming a rout, for pockets of the English were leaving the shield wall to pursue them. All hung in the balance. But William, though his horse had been brought down and he himself flung onto the ground, was not dead. Raising both his helmet and his voice, rallying his dispirited men, reminding them that they were warriors still, he succeeded in steeling his buckling line. And now it was the turn of the English to face a seeming breaking point. Those who had been pursuing their retreating adversaries down the hill found themselves suddenly turned upon. Surrounded, they proved easy meat. Hooves and trampling feet pulped their bodies into the mud. The slope of the hill turned slippery, a shambles of viscera and broken limbs. For a second time, it seemed as though the battle was decided. But just as the Normans had been rallied, so now did the English refuse to flee. Harold's great banner still fluttered defiantly in the breeze. The shield wall, though sorely depleted, held. The day remained unresolved. And even as the hours continued to pass, and the sun slowly to set, and the shadows to lengthen over the increasingly corpse-strewn slope of the battlefield, the confusion did not cease. It was, as one Norman would express it later in stupefied terms, an unheard-of kind of combat, with one side launching ceaseless attacks and manoeuvres, the other standing firmly as though rooted to the ground. Not all the exhaustion of men weighed down by the great weight of their shields and helmets and coats of iron could serve to diminish the desperate savagery of the battle. An hour before sunset, and still William's men were hurling themselves against the English, their spears splintered, as William's own was, their swords no less dyed with brains and blood than their dukes. Yet still the housecarls stood firm, swinging with their double-headed axes, bludgeoning their assailants, hacking through metal and flesh and bone. Certainly, planted as they were upon their hill, they could not hope to win. But then again, merely to hold their position, to win through to the night, to force a draw, would rank almost as a victory. William, isolated as he was in a hostile country, and with the sea at his back, could not afford a stalemate. Only succeed in standing firm until the coming of dusk, then, and Harold would most likely win the war. But he did not last the hour. Many stories would later be told about his end. One, the most repeated, had him being hit in the eye by an arrow. Whether true or not, it is certain that Norman horsemen, trampling Harold down, left him as just one among a heap of corpses piled around the toppled royal banner, just one among the fallen on a day of slaughter fit to put even Stamford Bridge into the shade. As darkness fell, and what was left of the English turned at last and fled into the gathering darkness, to be hunted throughout the night by William's exultant cavalry, it was the reek of blood and emptied bowels, together with the moans and sobs of the wounded, that bore prime witness to the butchery. Come the morning, however, and daylight unveiled a spectacle of carnage so appalling that even the victors were moved to pity. Far and wide the earth was covered with the flower of the English nobility and youth, drenched in gore. So hacked about was Harold's own body, and so disfigured the face, that it could barely be recognised.
Tom Holland. Millennium, The End of the World and the Forging of Christendom is published by Little Brown and is out now in hardback.